This week, the government approved the High-Speed 2 rail link, a line between London and Birmingham by 2026, and later a Y-shaped extension to Manchester and Leeds by 2033. High-Speed 1, by the way, was the line linking London and the Channel Tunnel. Most onlookers must be scratching their heads as both politicians and commentators have been switching all week between quoting figures for the first phase of the project and the second. But to give you a flavour, the cost of building and operating the line between Birmingham and London until the 2070s is predicted to be £27.4 billion. But the government expects to take in £13.9 billion from ticket sales. So-called economic benefits are less tangible things, such as the value of the 30 minutes saved by travellers going between London and Birmingham. These benefits total £23.1 billion, according to HS2 Ltd, the company set up by the Department for Transport to produce the business case for High-Speed 2. All these numbers, incidentally, are what's called present values. Distant benefits are less valuable than imminent benefits, so to reflect this, HS2 Ltd used the standard Treasury discount rate, discounting benefits by 3.5% each year. This means that overall, for each £1 that is spent on the link between Birmingham and London, the government expects £1.70 in return. Politicians and supporters often cite the figures for the full Y-shape, where the government expects to get between £1.80 and £2.50 for every pound that it spends. Not everyone's impressed by these numbers. One of the sceptics is Chris Stokes, a rail consultant who's done some number crunching for 51M, a group that campaigns against High-Speed 2.
So what government is forecasting in its latest evaluation of HS2 is that traffic will double by 2037. And the key question is where these people are going to come from. A lot of it is actually what's called generated travel, where if you provide a better service, more people will travel. But will that actually happen between Birmingham and London, Manchester and London, or Glasgow and London? I'm not convinced of that. And the parallel is with HS1. It was forecast that Eurostar would carry 25 million passengers a year by 2011, but actually it's 9 to 10 million. That's less than 40% of the forecast.
Well, I put this and other questions to Alison Munro, Chief Executive of HS2 Ltd.
Well, clearly you have to make some judgments about how you think things will be in the future, because no one can predict with certainty over that time period. So what we do is we look at what has happened in the past. Over the last 15 years, we've seen the number of people travelling, making long-distance rail trips double. Over the past 3 years, even during the recession, we've seen the number of passengers making long-distance journeys grow by 14%.
Now, the opponents of High-Speed 2, though, do question, I think, not those numbers, but how sustainable that trend is going to be. So Chris Stokes, for example, he says that switch to rail is not a trend that can be sustained. It's a temporary switch or a one-off switch from air travel and from road travel, and you can't just draw a straight line and expect that to continue.
Well, we haven't just drawn a straight line. With our latest updating of the numbers, we're effectively assuming that demand for travel continues to grow until 2037, and then it levels off. Now, there are some who say that's a rather pessimistic view, and that, in fact, demand could continue to grow for a much longer period than we are assuming. But we've deliberately taken what we believe is a rather cautious approach.
Well, there is. I think people feel cautious partly because of the experience of the Channel Tunnel, where there are very bullish forecasts about passenger numbers, and those passengers just are not being carried by Eurostar. So I think it's once bitten, twice shy, isn't it?
I think the experience of Eurostar was really rather different to what we're talking about here. And you were talking there about a relatively new market, rail travel between London and the continent. Here we're talking about an established market. And the other thing about the Eurostar market was that the reason really why they overestimated the amount of travel on Eurostar was they didn't predict the advent of the low-cost airlines. What's interesting, actually, is that the forecasts that have been on recently for the fast domestic services on High-Speed 1 have actually proved rather accurate.
Alison Munro. Chris Stokes also questions the way the economic benefits were calculated. These are the less tangible benefits to the economy at large, derived from having a new fast train service.
50% of the benefits to passengers are related to journey time savings, of which 74% relate to business travellers, although only 30% of passengers roundly are forecast to be travelling on business. The assumption is that the time of business passengers is very valuable, and actually the assumption is they don't work on trains, which I think anyone who travels on trains at business times will know is not the case. So £10 billion of the total benefits relating to time savings for passengers are, I think, very questionable.
Again, I turned to Alison Munro and asked her where she was getting the estimates of the value of shorter journey times.
The values that you quoted there are the values that are used for journeys that are made during business time, which, as you correctly say, are based on an average sort of cost to the employer of £75,000. But we use different values if people are travelling for commuting or if they're travelling for leisure purposes. The values are much lower. So it's £7 if you're commuting and £6 an hour if you're travelling by leisure. Whereas for a business traveller, we value that at £50 an hour. You're right in saying that the way we currently make the calculations, we effectively assume that time is not productive on trains. But what is interesting is that if you actually compare the values that we use with observed behaviour, so where business travellers actually make a choice about using a faster mode and paying a higher fare, or choosing a slower mode and a lower fare, the value, this £50 an hour value, does actually reflect the decisions they actually make about how they travel. We're not saying that people can't work on trains, but the other point is that as demand grows and trains become more and more crowded, in those conditions, people can't work on trains.
What happens if you just say saving time is not an economic benefit because actually it's just a case of people working with a laptop on a train or working with a laptop when they get to their destination? Does the business case really depend on that saved time?
I should point out that of the overall benefits that we've calculated for the schemes, of the 23 billion benefits I described to you, for example, for London to West Midlands, only about 30 to 40% of that is actually business time savings. So it's not the whole of the benefits that we're calculating don't depend on this business value of time. But you need to take a consistent approach between how you value business time and how you count the benefits of reducing overcrowding. Because we don't assume that time at the moment is productive, we put a low value on reducing crowding for business travellers. So all I'm saying is you need to be consistent. If, as you're suggesting, you should assume that time on a train is productive, then you also need to adjust that crowding value to be consistent. So when you make both of those adjustments, it's not a fudge, it's just saying you need to be consistent in your assumptions. If you make both of those adjustments, then we find it actually evens out.
Alison Munro of HS2 Ltd. Ultimately, whether the benefits of high-speed 2 are reckoned to outweigh the cost depends hugely on the underlying forecast, the interest rate used to adjust for benefits received sooner rather than later, passenger numbers in 2071, and of course those all-important cost overruns, or underruns, who knows. Neither the proponents of high-speed 2 nor the critics have a crystal ball.